The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914, by Christopher Clark. Picture this: a gorgeous summer morning, June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo. 6 gleaming cars wind their way along a wide boulevard, hugging the Miljacka River. In the second car, a sleek sports coupe with its top down, sits a striking couple. Meet Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire, and beside him, his adored wife Sophie. They're celebrating their wedding anniversary. The city pulses with life. Crowds pack the streets, waving enthusiastically. Black and yellow and red and yellow banners dance from every building. Despite warnings to stay away, the date itself reopens old wounds for many local Serbs, commemorating an ancient battle and a lost empire. The past few days had been so unexpectedly warm and friendly that Sophie had confided to a friend, "You are wrong after all. We are very happy about it." As the motorcade glides past the Countrya bridge, a young man in the crowd, a terrorist, suddenly freezes. His nerve fails him. The cars continue on. Moments later, another young man, Nedeljko Kabrinovich, steps forward from the crowd. He smacks a small bomb against a lamppost to arm it, then hurls it toward the Archduke's car. The driver spots it coming and slams the accelerator. The bomb ricochets off the back of the car and detonates beneath the following vehicle, wounding several officers. Pandemonium erupts. Smoke and dust fill the air. A tiny splinter has grazed Sophie's cheek, but instead of racing to safety, Franz Ferdinand does something unexpected. He stops. He's absolutely livid. "I come here as your guest," he'll later shout at the mayor, "and you people greet me with bombs." Yet his first instinct is concern for the wounded. He insists the motorcade push on to the town hall as planned, and afterward, he decides, they'll visit the injured officers at the hospital. After the reception, they climb back into the open car. The driver receives orders to stay on the main boulevard, avoiding the narrow side streets. But nobody bothers to tell the lead driver. As the motorcade passes the bazaar, the first car makes a sharp right onto Franz Joseph Street. The Archduke's driver follows suit. "This is the wrong way," the governor shouts from his seat opposite the royal couple. The car jerks to a halt, its gears disengaging, and begins slowly reversing. And in that moment, history itself seems to hold its breath. Standing right there, directly in front of a shop, is another assassin, a young man named Gavrilo Princip. The car has slowed to a crawl mere feet from where he stands. He draws his revolver. He fires twice. The world we inhabit today was forged in the seconds that followed. Those 2 shots would trigger a chain reaction leading to the First World War, a catastrophe that devoured 20 million lives, toppled 3 empires, and unleashed the horrors of the 20th century. For 100 years we've been asking, why? Who's to blame? But in his monumental work, The Sleepwalkers, historian Christopher Clark poses a different, more penetrating question. Not why did the war happen, but how? How did a peaceful continent, in a summer not unlike our own, stumble into such devastating conflict? This isn't a tale of a single villain or one simple mistake. It's the story of decision-makers, kings, emperors, ministers, generals, who were, as Clark describes them, watchful but unseeing. They were sleepwalkers, haunted by their own fears and ambitions, yet blind to the horror they were about to unleash. Over the next several minutes, we'll retrace their steps. We'll watch how a web of alliances, a storm of nationalism, and a series of tragic miscalculations transformed a murder on a quiet street corner into a global inferno. And in doing so, we'll uncover a timeless lesson about how even well-meaning leaders can, step by calculated step, walk their nations straight off a cliff. To truly grasp how the summer of 1914 became humanity's turning point, we can't begin in the grand palaces of Vienna or Berlin. We need to start 11 years earlier, in the dead of night, in Belgrade, Serbia's capital. Shortly after 2 a.m, on June 11, 1903, 28 Serbian army officers used dynamite to blow open the doors of the royal palace. Plunged into darkness, They hunted by candlelight, with drawn revolvers for King Alexander and Queen Draga. The deeply unpopular royal couple, seen as corrupt by many, were eventually found hiding in a small room behind their bedroom. They were dragged out and cut down in a hail of gunfire. What followed was pure savagery. Their bodies were stabbed, hacked with an axe, and hurled from the bedroom window into the garden below. This brutal regicide wasn't just murder. It was the birth of a new Serbia. The Obrenović dynasty was finished, replaced by the rival Karađorđević dynasty. For many Serbs, this felt like liberation. The new king, Petar Karađorđević, was a constitutional monarch, promising a more democratic future. The press gained freedom, political parties could operate without fear, and a new era of national confidence dawned. But the regicide left a dark shadow. The network of conspirators who carried out the murder didn't simply vanish. There remained a powerful, shadowy presence within the Serbian state, especially the army. Leading them was a gifted, secretive, and utterly ruthless young officer named Dragutin Dimitrijević, better known by his nickname Apis, after the bull god of ancient Egypt. Apis and his network represented a new force in Serbian politics, an ultra-nationalist military faction viewing itself as the true guardian of Serbian national destiny. They believed in Greater Serbia, a state uniting all Serbs, many living under Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian rule. This dream wasn't merely a political program. It was woven into Serbian culture's very fabric. Epic songs and poems kept it alive, telling of a glorious medieval Serbian empire, lost after a heroic defeat to the Turks at Kosovo's Field of Blackbirds on June 28, 1389. These songs spoke of heroes, traitors, and the sacred duty of revenge. Assassination and martyrdom were central themes. This powerful myth gave Serbian nationalism its explosive force, but also created profound tension. Greater Serbia could only be realized through violent struggle against two great empires on its borders. The conspirators around Apis saw themselves as instruments of this struggle. They operated in shadows, creating secret organizations to run guerrilla operations and spread propaganda in territories like Ottoman-controlled Macedonia. One of the most important secret societies formed in 1911. Its name was Union or Death, but it was better known by its terrifying moniker, the Black Hand. Its symbol was a skull and crossbones, a knife, a bomb, and a vial of poison. Its undisputed leader was Apis. The civilian government, led by shrewd and cautious Prime Minister Nikola Pasic, found itself in a difficult position. Pasic was a veteran politician, a master of survival who'd spent years in exile and even faced a death sentence. He understood the nationalist networks, power, and knew crushing them risked civil war. But he also knew their reckless activities could drag Serbia into disastrous conflict with powerful neighbors. He tried walking a tightrope, sometimes placating the military conspirators, sometimes trying to sideline them. But he could never truly control them. The Serbian state had become a strange hybrid, a modern parliamentary democracy on the surface, but with a deep, shadowy undercurrent of radical nationalism driven by secret military societies. This created dangerous ambiguity. Was Serbia a responsible state actor or a launchpad for revolutionary violence? Even seasoned diplomats found it nearly impossible to tell. This was the volatile, unstable Serbia facing the colossal Austro-Hungarian Empire across the border. And for leaders in Vienna, Serbia was becoming an intolerable problem. For centuries, the Habsburg Empire of Austria-Hungary had been a cornerstone of European stability. It was vast, multinational, a patchwork of 11 official nationalities including Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Serbs, and Croats, all under the aged Emperor Franz Joseph's rule. To its enemies, especially Serb nationalists, the empire was a prison of nations, a decaying relic doomed to collapse. True, political life was often paralyzed by bitter squabbles between ethnic groups. But this picture misleads. In the years before 1914, the empire experienced strong economic growth. It was governed by rule of law, with a professional bureaucracy that, despite its faults, provided public education, welfare, and sanitation. Most citizens, most of the time, were loyal subjects. The empire wasn't collapsing. It was a functioning, modernizing state grappling with the immense challenge of multinational governance. Its biggest problem lay on its southern border. After 1903, Belgrade's new regime became openly hostile to the dual monarchy. The freewheeling Serbian press, filled with nationalist attacks on Vienna. More worrying still was rising irredentist activity. Belgrade actively supported networks of Serb nationalists inside the empire's borders, particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina, occupied by Austria-Hungary since 1878 and home to a large Serb population. For Vienna's leaders, this was existential. The Greater Serbia project aimed at nothing less than their empire's dismemberment. From their perspective, Serbia was a rogue state, a hotbed of criminal agitation, systematically poisoning its own South Slav population against the monarchy. Tension reached boiling point in 1908. In a move designed to signal permanent rule and end Serbian agitation, Vienna formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. Serbia's reaction was explosive. Mass rallies erupted in Belgrade with speakers clamoring for war. A new mass organization, Serbian National Defense, Narodna Odbrana, sprang up to organize guerrilla bands and espionage networks inside Bosnia. For a moment, it looked like Serbia might launch a suicidal war against its giant neighbor. This complex and dangerous dance between Austria-Hungary and Serbia was the war's immediate backdrop. But it was only one part of a much larger story. These two countries' fates were becoming entangled in the great powers' shifting alliances. A delicate balance that had kept peace for decades was beginning to unravel. If you examined a map of European alliances in 1887, you'd see a complex web of crisscrossing agreements. It was a multipolar world, a system of precarious equilibrium. At its center was Germany, led by its brilliant and cautious chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck's goal was keeping France, still bitter after its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, isolated. He did this by maintaining alliances with both Austria-Hungary and Russia, ensuring they didn't fall into French arms. Britain remained aloof in splendid isolation, focused on its vast overseas empire. Fast forward 20 years to 1907, the picture has completely changed. The continent is divided into two rigid opposing blocs. On one side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and a somewhat unreliable Italy. On the other, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Great Britain. How did this dramatic polarization happen? The first crucial step was the Franco-Russian alliance's formation in 1894. After Bismarck's dismissal in 1890, his successors in Berlin made a fateful decision. They let the treaty with Russia lapse. This opened the door for France to achieve its long-held dream of an anti-German coalition. St. Petersburg was initially hesitant. The autocratic Russian Tsar had little in common with Republican French leaders. But fear pushed them together. Russians worried that Britain, their great imperial rival in Asia, was about to join forces with Germany and Austria-Hungary. This prospect of a massive hostile coalition forced Russia's hand. The Franco-Russian alliance was born. For the first time, Germany faced the nightmare scenario it had always sought to avoid: the possibility of war on two fronts. The second major shift was Britain's decision to abandon isolation and align with France and Russia. This wasn't primarily driven by fear of Germany. For most of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain's greatest rivals weren't the Germans, but the French in Africa, and above all, the Russians in Asia. The Great Game, a struggle for influence in Central Asia, Persia, and along India's frontiers, was British foreign policy's central preoccupation. But the immense cost of defending a global empire, especially after the Boer War in South Africa, forced a strategic rethink in London. The British realized they could no longer afford confronting both France and Russia worldwide. The solution was making peace with old rivals. In 1904, they signed the Entente Cordiale with France, settling colonial disputes in Africa. In 1907, they signed a convention with Russia, dividing Persia into spheres of influence and resolving conflicts in Central Asia. These agreements weren't initially anti-German. They were designed to reduce strains on the British Empire. But they had a profound and unintended consequence. By settling their differences, Britain, France, and Russia laid foundations for a new alignment that would increasingly be seen, especially from Berlin, as hostile encirclement. What was Germany's role in all this? Leaders in Berlin made a series of critical miscalculations. They believed rivalry between Britain and Russia was so deep and enduring that the two powers would never join forces. They failed to see that by building a massive new navy, they were creating an unnecessary friction source with Britain, the world's dominant sea power. This naval race didn't cause Britain to join the Entente, but it soured the atmosphere and made rapprochement with Germany much harder. German diplomacy was often clumsy and aggressive, as during the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, when Berlin tried breaking the new Anglo-French Entente, but only succeeded in strengthening it. So by 1907, the stage was set. Bismarck's fluid, multipolar world was gone, replaced by a rigid, bipolar system. This didn't make war inevitable. In fact, in the years just before 1914, there were signs of détente, a relaxing of tensions, especially between Britain and Germany. But division into two armed camps created a dangerous new dynamic. A crisis that might once have been contained locally now had potential to drag the entire continent into war. The European system had become a giant, interconnected machine, and a small spark in a remote corner could now ignite the whole thing. But Europe's division into two blocks is only part of the story. To understand the decisions made in July 1914, we have to look inside the great powers, governments. What we find is not a set of unified, rational actors, but a chaos of competing voices. Foreign policy wasn't made by single individuals. It emerged from messy interaction between monarchs, ministers, ambassadors, and generals. In the three great continental empires, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, monarchs still held immense formal power. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Emperor Franz Joseph, and Tsar Nicholas II were cousins, part of a dynastic web spanning the continent. They could appoint and dismiss ministers, they commanded armed forces, and they conducted their own personal diplomacy through letters and meetings. But their actual influence was often limited. Kaiser Wilhelm II was notoriously erratic and impulsive. His ministers learned to manage him, often ignoring his wild ideas and steering policy behind his back. Tsar Nicholas II was shy and indecisive, easily swayed by competing court factions. Only when he personally championed a policy, as he did with Russia's disastrous expansion into the Far East before the Russo-Japanese War, could he truly set the agenda. But that war's catastrophic failure shattered his authority, and for years afterward, power shifted to his ministers. Even in more democratic states, there were deep divisions. In Britain, Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey was a powerful figure. He was a liberal imperialist, deeply suspicious of Germany, and committed to the Entente with France and Russia. But his views were opposed by a majority of his own cabinet colleagues, the so-called radicals, who feared being dragged into continental war and favored a more conciliatory policy toward Germany. To get his way, Grey often operated in secret, making commitments to the French, especially through military staff talks, that the cabinet knew nothing about. This created dangerous ambiguity. The French believed they had firm commitment of British support. The Germans believed Britain would likely remain neutral. Both were, in a sense, right. In France, the situation was even more chaotic. Governments rose and fell with bewildering speed. Foreign ministers came and went. This gave immense power to permanent officials at the Foreign Ministry, the Quai d'Orsay, and to powerful ambassadors like Paul Cambon in London, and his brother Jules in Berlin. These men formed a kind of inner government, often pursuing their own policies and sabotaging those of their political masters. This happened in 1911 during the Agadir crisis, when hawkish Quai d'Orsay officials deliberately provoked a confrontation with Germany over Morocco, against the wishes of the more conciliatory Prime Minister Joseph Caillaux. And then there was the military's growing influence. Everywhere in Europe, generals pushed for bigger budgets, more advanced weapons, and more aggressive war plans. They were often in conflict with civilian leaders worried about the arms race's immense cost. But in the years before 1914, the soldiers began gaining the upper hand. In Russia, the powerful and corrupt war minister Vladimir Sukhomlinov built a war party within government, systematically undermining cautious Prime Minister Vladimir Kokovtsov. In Germany, Chief of the General Staff Helmuth von Moltke became obsessed with the idea of preventive war against Russia. He argued that since war was inevitable, it was better fighting sooner, before Russia's massive rearmament program was complete, and Germany's chances of victory had vanished. This internal chaos made the European system even more unpredictable. Governments sent mixed signals. Their intentions were opaque, not just to enemies, but often to their own allies. A fog of mutual distrust descended upon the continent. This was the volatile, fragmented, and deeply dysfunctional world about to be put to the ultimate test. The spark, when it came, wasn't lit in Paris, Berlin, or London. It was lit in the Balkans. The Balkan Peninsula, in the years before 1914, was a region in turmoil. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, was in terminal decline, and its retreat from the region created a power vacuum. Into this vacuum rushed newly independent Balkan states: Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, all eager to expand territories and realize nationalist dreams. This created a tinderbox of overlapping claims and bitter rivalries. The great powers had traditionally managed to contain these local conflicts. But in 1911, everything changed. Italy, in a completely unprovoked act of aggression, launched an invasion of Libya, then an Ottoman province. This attack broke the ice, as one observer put it. It sent a signal to Balkan states that the old order was crumbling, and the time for opportunism had arrived. With secret encouragement from Russia, Serbia and Bulgaria put aside their rivalry over Macedonia and formed an alliance. In October 1912, together with Greece and Montenegro, they launched a coordinated assault on remaining Ottoman territories in Europe. This was the First Balkan War. To the world's astonishment, the Balkan League achieved a stunning victory. In just 6 weeks, Ottoman forces were routed, driven out of almost all their European possessions. But victors immediately began quarreling over spoils. Serbia, promised an outlet to the Adriatic Sea, was blocked by Austria-Hungary, which insisted on creating an independent Albania. Frustrated in the West, the Serbs turned attention back to Macedonia, demanding a larger share than agreed upon in their treaty with Bulgaria. The Bulgarians refused. In June 1913, the Second Balkan War broke out, this time pitting Bulgaria against its former allies Serbia and Greece, now joined by Romania and even the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria was quickly and brutally defeated, losing most territory gained in the First War. These two wars, fought with incredible ferocity and marked by horrific atrocities, transformed the geopolitical landscape. The most obvious winner was Serbia. Its territory doubled, its population grew by more than 1.5 million, and its army, battle-hardened and confident, was now a major regional power. For Austria-Hungary, this was a nightmare. A large, aggressive, and hostile Serbia, backed by Russia, now sat on its southern border. The old balance of power in the Balkans, which had always favored Vienna, was shattered. But the most dangerous consequence of the Balkan Wars was how they drew the great power alliances deeper into the region's conflicts. This was especially true of the Franco-Russian alliance. For France, the alliance with Russia was the cornerstone of its security against Germany. But the French military had long worried about the speed and direction of a Russian attack in the event of war. Would the Russians mobilize quickly enough? And would they concentrate forces against Germany, the principal adversary? Or would they get bogged down fighting Austria-Hungary in the Balkans? The Balkan Wars seemed to offer a solution to this problem. French Premier Raymond Poincaré, a staunch nationalist deeply suspicious of Germany, came to believe that a war starting in the Balkans was actually the most favorable scenario for the Entente. An Austro-Serbian conflict would tie down a large part of the Austrian army, allowing Russians to throw the bulk of their forces against Germany. This would force the Germans to divide their armies, taking pressure off France in the West. Starting in 1912, Poincaré began systematically balkanizing the Franco-Russian alliance. In a series of conversations with Russian ambassador in Paris, Alexander Izvolsky, he made a crucial commitment. If a crisis in the Balkans led to conflict between Austria and Russia, and if that conflict drew in Germany, France would not hesitate to fulfill its alliance obligations. In other words, France would go to war for a cause that began in Serbia. This was a radical departure from previous French policy, which had always sought to avoid being dragged into Russia's Balkan quarrels. To reinforce this commitment, Poincaré pushed the Russians to accelerate military preparations, using the leverage of massive French loans to fund construction of strategic railways that would speed Russian troops to the German frontier. The Russians, for their part, were also hardening their position. Humiliated in 1908 and alarmed by rising German influence in Constantinople, they came to see Serbia as their key salient in the Balkans. After the Balkan Wars, their old client Bulgaria drifted into the orbit of the Central Powers. This left Serbia as Russia's only reliable partner in the region. Russian minister in Belgrade, the fiery pan-Slavist Nikolai Hartwig, became one of the most powerful figures in Serbian politics, constantly encouraging the government to take a firm stand against Austria. In spring 1914, Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov told the Serbs that their promised land lay in Austrian-Hungarian territory, and that they must prepare for an inescapable future struggle. By summer 1914, a geopolitical tripwire had been set. Europe's two great alliance blocs, security had become tied to a volatile and violent region's fate. The French and Russians had constructed what became known as the Balkan Inception scenario. They didn't plan to start a war, but they'd created a mechanism by which a local conflict could automatically escalate into a continental catastrophe. All that was needed was a spark. On the evening of July 23, 1914, 25 days after the assassination, Austrian minister in Belgrade, Baron Giesel, delivered a note to the Serbian government. It wasn't just a note, it was an ultimatum. The Austrians had spent the intervening weeks in agonizing debate. The Hawks, led by Chief of the General Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf, had been clamoring for war from the moment news from Sarajevo arrived. War, 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 was his simple prescription, but there were voices of caution. Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza warned that a war with Serbia was too risky, especially since it was unclear what Romania, a country with a large Hungarian minority, would do. The decisive factor was Germany. On July 5, an Austrian envoy, Count Hoyos, was sent to Berlin to ask a simple question. If Austria took action against Serbia, and if that action led to war with Russia, could Vienna count on German support? The answer that came back from Kaiser Wilhelm II and his chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, was an unequivocal yes. Germany offered Austria its full backing, a promise that became known as the blank check. Why did the Germans do it? They didn't want a European war. They believed, wrongly, that Russia wasn't yet ready for major conflict and would likely back down. They felt their ally, Austria-Hungary, was facing an existential threat and had a right to defend itself, and they feared that if they failed to support Vienna, they'd lose their only reliable ally and be left completely isolated. It was, they believed, a calculated risk. Emboldened by German support, the Austrians drafted an ultimatum designed to be impossible for Serbia to accept. It contained 10 demands, including suppression of all anti-Austrian propaganda, dissolution of nationalist organizations like Narodna Odbrana, and arrest of specific officials implicated in the plot. But the most explosive demands were points 5 and 6, which required Serbia to accept participation of Austro-Hungarian officials in the investigation on Serbian soil. This was a direct challenge to Serbian sovereignty. The Serbs were given just 48 hours to reply. Belgrade's government was thrown into panic. At first, it seemed they had no choice but to accept. Serbia was exhausted after 2 Balkan wars, and in no condition to fight another. But then messages of support began arriving from St. Petersburg. Russian Foreign Minister Sazonov told the Serbs they could count on Russian support, and that no state could accept such demands without committing suicide. This was the crucial turning point. Reassured by Russia, the Serbian government drafted a reply that was a masterpiece of diplomatic evasion. They accepted most points, but with so many reservations and conditions that it amounted to rejection of the most crucial demands. At 5:58 p.m. on July 25th, just 2 minutes before the deadline, Prime Minister Pasic personally handed the reply to the Austrian minister. Baron Giesel glanced at it, saw it wasn't an unconditional acceptance, and within half an hour, he and his entire staff were on a train out of Belgrade. Diplomatic relations were broken. The machine was now in motion. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. On the morning of the 29th, Austrian gunboats shelled Belgrade. In St. Petersburg, the news was greeted with a mixture of outrage and resolve. Sazonov had believed from the moment he saw the ultimatum that this meant la guerre européenne, the European war. On July 29th, Russia ordered a partial mobilization against Austria-Hungary. But the generals warned that partial mobilization was technically impossible and strategically dangerous. It would disrupt plans for general mobilization against Germany, should that become necessary. Sazonov was persuaded. On the afternoon of July 30th, after a tense audience with the Tsar, he got the order he wanted. Russia would proceed to full general mobilization. This was the decision that made a European war virtually inevitable. Russian general mobilization was the first of the great powers. It came at a moment when Germany hadn't yet even declared a state of impending war. For the German military, the Russian move was a red flag. Their entire war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, was based on speed. It required them to defeat France quickly in the west before turning the full weight of their armies against the slow-mobilizing Russian giant in the east. A full Russian mobilization threatened to wreck this timetable. When news of the Russian order reached Berlin, a sense of panic set in. Ultimatums were fired off to St. Petersburg, demanding a halt to all military measures, and to Paris, asking whether France would remain neutral in a Russo-German war. There was no reply from Russia. The French simply said they'd act in accordance with their own interests. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, it declared war on France. And on August 4th, German troops crossed the border into neutral Belgium, setting their Great Western Offensive in motion. And what of Britain? Throughout the crisis, Sir Edward Grey had been caught in a terrible bind. The cabinet was deeply divided, with a majority still opposed to intervention. Grey made desperate attempts at mediation, but he also warned the Germans that if France were drawn into conflict, Britain might not be able to stand aside. French Ambassador Paul Cambon was in despair, believing Britain was about to abandon its friend. "They are going to drop us," he muttered, white-faced, after one difficult meeting with Grey. But 2 things tipped the balance. The first was the German naval threat. The cabinet agreed that if the German fleet attacked the undefended northern coast of France, the Royal Navy would intervene. The second, and decisive, factor was Belgium. The German invasion of neutral Belgium, a country whose neutrality Britain had guaranteed by treaty, created a powerful moral case for war. It united the cabinet, swayed public opinion, and gave interventionists the justification they needed. On August 4th, Britain delivered an ultimatum to Berlin, demanding withdrawal from Belgian territory. When it went unanswered, Britain too was at war. The lights, as Grey famously remarked, were going out all over Europe. The Sleepwalkers had finally reached their destination. Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers is a masterful and profound book. It doesn't offer easy answers or point a finger at a single guilty party. Instead, it immerses us in the complex, confusing, and ultimately tragic world of 1914. Its greatest contribution is shifting our focus from asking why the war happened to asking how. The central metaphor of The Sleepwalker is powerful. These weren't evil men for the most part bent on destruction. They were, in Clark's portrayal, intelligent, professional, and often cautious leaders doing what they believed was best for their countries. They were operating in an environment of intense pressure, with incomplete information and deep distrust of opponents. They were all convinced that their own actions were defensive, while seeing aggression and malevolence in others' actions. This is what theorists call the security dilemma, where steps one state takes to increase its security are seen as threatening by another, which then takes its own countermeasures, leading to an escalating spiral of hostility. The book reminds us that history isn't a simple morality play. There were no clear heroes or villains in 1914. The Austrians had a legitimate grievance against Serbia. The Serbs were pursuing a nationalist dream that, from their perspective, was just and righteous. The Russians felt a deep-seated obligation to their Slavic little brothers, and profound anxiety about their own security. The Germans were haunted by fear of encirclement and a war on two fronts. The French were bound by an alliance they believed essential to their survival, and the British were torn between their desire to stay out of continental quarrels and their fear of a German-dominated Europe. Each of these perspectives was rational, given the information and assumptions of the time. The tragedy is that these rational, localized perspectives, when combined, created a system that was profoundly irrational and self-destructive. Each state, in pursuing its own security, contributed to the insecurity of all the others. They were all sleepwalking, aware of the risks, but not of the reality of the catastrophe they were collectively creating. What are the lessons for us today? The world of 1914 can feel very distant, a world of emperors, archdukes, and arcane diplomatic protocols. But the dynamics Clark describes are timeless. We still live in a world of competing nation-states, of shifting alliances, of mutual suspicion. We still see leaders who filter complex realities through simple, self-serving narratives. We still see how a crisis in one part of the world can, through a chain of interconnected commitments, escalate into much larger conflict. Perhaps the most important takeaway from the Sleepwalkers is a call for empathy and for deeper understanding of complexity. It's easy to judge the past from the comfort of the present. It's much harder to understand why intelligent and experienced people made the choices they did. Clark's book challenges us to do just that. It asks us to put ourselves in the shoes of those men of 1914, to see the world as they saw it, and to understand that they weren't monsters, but human beings trapped in a situation that was, in the end, beyond their control. If there's one simple action you can take away from this summary, it's this. The next time you hear a simple story about a complex international crisis, a story with a clear hero and a clear villain, be skeptical. Remember the Sleepwalkers of 1914. Remember that the path to catastrophe is often paved with good intentions, and that the most dangerous people aren't always those who seek war, but those who are blind to the consequences of their own actions. That was a deep dive into The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark. We've explored the main currents of this incredible book, but I hope you understand that what we've covered is just the beginning. The real power of this book lies in the details, in the rich and textured way Clark brings this lost world to life. This summary is meant to be a map, to give you the lay of the land and help you decide if this journey is for you. If any part of this story has sparked your curiosity or made you think differently about how history happens, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just an act of learning, it's an experience that will stay with you, a powerful reminder of the fragility of peace and the human cost of misunderstanding. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you've found this journey through history valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the Billionaire's Bookshelf. It helps our community grow and ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another book that has the power to change the way you see the world. Let's keep learning and growing together.